Because interpreting a poem or explaining a historical event or describing a painting directly reflects the writer's opinion. The use of the first person singular is increasingly allowed or even recommended in style guides commonly used in the humanities, such as MLA and Chicago. However, as always check whether a journal publisher has any specific requirements regarding the use of the first person, and it should not be overused. We'll come to that again in a moment. The quotation I've given here is from Michael Candell. Let the first person singular be a tool that you take out when you think it's needed and that you leave in the toolbox when you think it's not. So when is it needed and when is it not needed? When might you wish to use I, the first person singular? To express assertiveness, authority, and originality, to claim a particular idea or argument as your own, and to show how it builds on or departs from another scholar's work. To clarify that you are expressing an opinion rather than claiming that something is absolute fact. So the example I've given here is from a very recent article from the Classical Quarterly, published by Cambridge University Press. While Salins uses his theory horizontally, examining gift exchange among people of an equal status, I suggest that a vertical approach is more appropriate for the Persian Empire. Here, the author's interpretation is contrasted with that of the scholar he references to begin with. Removing I suggest would make the tone much more forceful. It might even sound dismissive of the scholar quoted, the scholar referenced here. It could even sound dogmatic, implying that the author believes that they have the final word on the subject. And as you all know, this is very rarely the case in any field of scholarship. However, as I've mentioned, avoid overusing I. When used too much, I can be off-putting for readers, simply because it's repetitive, but also it can appear excessively informal. You are the author of your paper or your thesis or your book, so if an opinion is expressed in it, it is usually clear that this opinion is yours. So unless you're showing how your opinion diverges from other scholars' interpretations, for example, it's not usually necessary to add phrases like, I believe that, or it seems to me that. I've given an example here from a slightly older article, but still a recent one, from Victorian Literature and Culture, again published by Cambridge University Press. Robert says the production of a novel or any textual object is a complex process. So he doesn't feel the need to say, I believe that the production of a novel is a complex process. And there's two reasons for that. The first is that this statement is, as you can imagine, relatively self-evident. The second reason, and most important one, is that Roberts goes on to explain why this is the case, or why he believes that this is the case. However, if you prefer not to use I, there are some alternatives and some workarounds. Another common usage in the humanities is the first person plural, which identifies the author with the reader. Sometimes this is called the inclusive we. And the example I've given here is from a book this time, one of the Cambridge Companions. There's a bit of a focus on Cambridge here, isn't there? Apologies. If we consider North America more broadly, the Canadian writer Margaret Atwood has written significant works of science fiction. Here, the author positions himself and his reader within a target community of people who are familiar with science fiction writers in North America. Using we like this can be a helpful way of creating a sense of rapport and commonality between the writer and the reader. As I've given a couple of examples just below. Phrases like let us now consider, we now turn to, as we shall see, can be quite useful as well for signposting transitions in your academic writing. However, the use of we can backfire, probably for obvious reasons, if the reader does not agree that they are affiliated with the writer in that sense, or feels that perhaps they're being condescended to. And that's most likely to occur if one overuses we, or perhaps if one overuses we for controversial statements or ones that are very clearly expressions of the writer's opinion that others might not be expected to share. A couple of other workarounds. We have the replacement of the researcher, the I or the we, with this article, this chapter, this thesis argues that. So this is still the active grammatical voice, but it's a much more impersonal formulation because it does remove the voice of the researcher. And this is most commonly found in abstracts in the humanities, in the humanities. And the next workaround is the passive voice. Here it is argued that, for example, again, this removes the voice of the researcher, creating a more formal and much more, for obvious reasons, impersonal style. But it also can create more lengthy, more complex, and more awkward grammatical constructions. Finally, we have, again, the active voice, but the impersonal one as the grammatical subject. One may argue that this constructs a hypothetical reader or a hypothetical observer or a hypothetical agent of any kind who's interested in the research. However, there are some concerns here. You will have seen this, no doubt, in humanities writing, but it may be perceived as somewhat old-fashioned. It can be perceived as condescending, particularly outside UK English context. So I rarely see it in US English writing.
Could one, I mean, you're quite, I've used one again there.
I do too.
Yeah, I mean, because when I do business writing, I also say exactly as you've just said, that it's a little archaic now to use one. So could you use the word you instead, or is that not a...
I would recommend against that. I think in writing, probably not actually in the humanities. I did look this up actually before when I was doing the research for this webinar. And it occurred to me that I'd not seen it used ever that I remember in humanities writing. However, I have seen it in conference papers, and we'll come to that just a little bit later. The one thing to note about conference papers, though, is that they can be turned into, of course, in the written conference proceedings. And so you have the issue of excessive informality potentially there. I would recommend, sorry, a very simple answer. I'd probably recommend against that one, unless speaking directly to a live audience.
Okay.
Great. So the second area of focus when you're establishing your own voice as researcher is using other people's voices. So quoting and citing. How we engage with primary and secondary sources is a really important way to construct and maintain and negotiate our own voice as researcher. Today, researchers in the humanities are expected to invite a variety of voices into their research, using information from a variety of sources, primary, secondary, and so on, to support their arguments, to demonstrate their understanding of the research context, and to show their positioning relative to the scholarly community. So how much citing, how much quoting is too much, how little is too little, and how can we avoid being drowned out? At one extreme, researchers who don't quote enough can seem ignorant. Oh, sorry, ignore that for the moment. At one extreme, researchers who don't quote enough can seem ignorant of the surrounding research. They can seem complacent or even arrogant. You know, why would you not quote if quoting should be done? The other extreme, researchers may quote too much, and they run the risk of having their own voice drowned out. At an even further extreme, they may seem to lack originality. They may even be accused of something closer to plagiarism. They're just using other people's arguments over and over again without distinguishing their own. Ideally, we should aim to integrate other scholars' opinions into our research in a way that is varied, well-balanced, and comparative. This will allow us to demonstrate where our own voice builds on or departs from others in the field. We can thus show assertiveness and interpretive agency without seeming defensive, complacent, or arrogant. And there are some key ways to do this, one of which I've already brought up here. First is paraphrasing sources. Putting source material into our own words rather than quoting it directly is a form of appropriation, and it tends, therefore, to foreground our own voice. The example I've given here is from the text I quoted earlier. Thus, as Pascal Casanova argues in the case of the novel more generally, it is difficult to constrain its history to one nation. So here the author summons up the argument of Casanova, but doesn't quote directly from him. When we do this, we must make sure that we are representing the author's original meaning accurately and not partially. So here there's been the accurate caveat, as Casanova argues in the case of the novel more generally. So this isn't entirely applicable to the author's own case, and he acknowledges that properly there. The second option is integrated or partial quotation. And I have adapted the above quotation to demonstrate this. Thus, as Pascal Casanova argues in the case of the novel more generally, quoted, it is difficult to constrain its history to one nation. When we integrate someone else's words into our own sentences, we create in effect a hybrid voice, combining our own voice with that of another scholar. And we allow that scholar, therefore, to be heard directly, but as part of the point we are making overall. So we are still giving more weight to our own voice here. The third is another way to manage our voice in relation to others is to comment reflectively and evaluatively on sources. And of course, we are used to doing this in the humanities. The example I've given here for a wonderful article, actually, again, also, I think, published by the Cambridge University Press. I do not intend to argue against Todorov selections from the Arabian Nights, especially the popular tales like Sinbad, but I would like to question his phrase narrative men and replace it for the time being with narrative women. Here, the author clearly indicates where she diverges from the scholar mentioned, quotes in part and adjusts the original use, the original quotation somewhat. The final one, the final way in which we can use others' voices in negotiation with our own is through full quotation and even block quotation. And this tends to, as you can imagine, tends to prioritize another person's voice over our own. Block quotations or full quotations tend to occur in two main places in an article or in a chapter or in a dissertation. Before that article begins, to set the scene and situate the research relative to the cultural context. Within the main text, it's normally preceded and followed by detailed close reading of the text there. Great.
I've just got a quick question that's popped up here.
Of course.
Someone has said they read papers where the author has used I to describe their own work. Is this encouraged, in serious research writing? So what is it? I think it means he's referring to documents that journals he's written before.
Sure. I mean,
I have.
Yeah. As mentioned earlier, a lot of journal style guides are now recommending the use of the first person singular. Some don't. I think MLA allows but doesn't prefer the first person. So it's really okay, but it certainly isn't in any way perceived as a sort of unscholarly thing to do, unless it is overused. And we will come as well at the end of this session to the differences in the use of the first person between dissertations and between published scholarly writing, because that's another important distinction to make there.
I mean, here he says that this is someone who's been referring to their own artwork. So Oh,
I see. Interesting.
Yes, that they just thrown that one in there on top. So okay. I don't know how that slots in on this. It
would be rather self-referential, wouldn't it, to be analysing one's own? That's an interesting case. I'll have to think about that.
Dance, art.
Yes, interesting.
I've noticed you've used the word arrogant a number of times. We want to avoid sounding arrogant. And I guess there is a danger there, isn't there? If you keep referring to as I have written, as I have.
Yes, but it can go either way. It can sound arrogant, or it can sound very uncertain, as if you're constantly trying to say, well, it's only me who thinks this. It's only I who have this opinion. Others might not, and so it depends. It depends really on the context.
Yes,
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
The next thing to turn to other ways of creating what I'm calling here a signature style. I've got a quotation that I really like from Eric Hayot or Hayot. Writing distills, crafts, and pressure tests ideas. It creates ideas. Nowhere is this more true than in the humanities. As humanities researchers, the language we use is inseparable from the research we do. The writing is the research. How we write can be, therefore, as important as, or almost as important as, what we write. To help the reader follow our ideas and arguments as they unfold on the page, our writing must be clear, logically ordered, and varied enough to hold the reader's interest. Ideally, it should be enjoyable to read as well as easy to follow for the target reader. This can be a particular challenge for researchers writing in a non-native language. There are no set rules for creating a unique and appealing style in humanities research, but the three key principles that I would suggest are as follows. The first is clarity and precision of expression. English is such a rich language that subtle differences in word choice, for example, can be a challenge. Invest in a good English dictionary, ideally the online Oxford English Dictionary if you or your institution has access, and use it regularly. An idea can be expressed in clear language, but also scholarly and rigorous. Don't hide behind overly obscure language. The second, ensure variety, or as putting it in the same way, avoid repetitiveness. Avoid repeating the same sentence structures over and over again. Alternate long and short sentences, for example. Avoid repeating the same words too often. If you need to make a point more than once, and of course we almost inevitably do to ensure that the reader understands, reframe it and put it in a different way each time. The third important criterion for a signature style is a unity of style or voice. Make sure that how you write and the way you're writing is fairly consistent across your article or your chapter or your book or your edited chapter, which is particularly important, of course, when you're writing longer pieces, such as dissertations. And I know myself that the writing that one does at an earlier stage tends to be less fluid, much more awkward than the writing one does later on. So the answer here is to continuously revise and refine your writing in light of not only your own response to it, but also feedback from other scholars, from colleagues, and even sometimes from those who aren't experts in your field. It can be the idea of an elevator pitch, or speaking to a lay reader, can be a really useful way of clarifying your ideas and how you express them. The almost more importantly, and this is something I will come back to again later. Yes, here we go. Reading widely and thinking about why you admire certain authors who write in your subfield. What makes their prose style so enjoyable to read? Not just informative, but enjoyable. Do they dive straight into their subject, for example? Or do they set the scene with an anecdote or a piece of microhistory? Do they use humour or metaphor to make their writing more lively and evocative? Do they ask questions of the reader? How do they develop their ideas through sentences and paragraphs?
Yeah, I think that's reading widely and deeply is something that keeps coming up. I remember our former chief editor, Mike. I mean, he was a humanities scholar, and he would spend his free time reading books on electronics and physical sciences, and then he sort of started studying mathematics as well. He was sit there having beers and talking about maths theories. He's and you're quite right. I think reading widely just gives you so many different ways of thinking about how you can, well, just seeing how other people express themselves gives you a lot more options, doesn't it? I've got I've got another query that's just come in here. The participant writes, informal conversation, it is possible to switch between I and we and one, and it can also occur in academic writing. Personally, he would never want to do this, but he's currently editing a book in which one of his contributors does. And he wants to know, should this be discouraged or should he not be so concerned?
That's a really, really good point. I think that those three, the first person singular and the we and the one, have slightly different inflections in meaning. So it may be that the we would be probably more appropriate for general statements that are relatively uncontroversial. We can see in this painting the use of, I'm sorry, I'm not an art scholar or art history scholar, so what I'm saying might not be relevant. But we can see, that X is the case. If X is indeed probably the case, that's a more valid use of the word we. One, as I mentioned earlier, tends to be a little more distanced from the objectively factual. So to answer the question, I think I probably would minimize the unnecessary variance in self-reference or reference to a shared community of readers. But do be aware that those meanings can be slightly different and might be appropriately used there.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Great. So clearly from the content I've presented so far, we have lots and lots of choices in terms of how to construct and present a voice as a humanities researcher. To help navigate these complexities, we should ask ourselves two interconnected questions. What, why are we writing? And for whom are we writing? I have just a couple of examples here. I'm sure that you can think of many more yourselves. How readership and form may affect voice. Probably the best example I can think of is that which I mentioned earlier, the difference between a PhD dissertation or thesis and the published work that dissertation or thesis may turn into. When we write a PhD dissertation, we have a very specific audience in mind. We may even know the names of our forthcoming examiners from the outset. We are writing to prove to them our proficiency in the field. So we may need to do a good deal of signposting of our arguments and how and why the research represents an original contribution. Phrases like, in the next chapter, I demonstrate that, this research shows for the first time that, etc., etc. The function of journal and book publishers is to connect authors with readers, which means that in an article or a book, you're speaking to a much wider audience. So among the many tasks involved in turning one's PhD dissertation into a research monograph or series of journal articles, as many of you will know, is to make our work accessible to a wider range of readers and to remove such signposting. So that may mean, it's quite likely to mean the first person singular will come out of your monograph or your series of articles, because you don't need to keep saying, I'm doing this, I suggest this is what my research is arguing. The other obvious example here of voice and how form relates to voice is when we speak for real, when we deliver a conference paper. When you're speaking to a live audience, voice is inevitably even more important. Aim to write your work to be heard. Shorten your sentences, use more punchy phrases, and aim for a more chatty or informal style through modulations in your voice, for example, even if you are reading straight from the page, as I am doing here. I'm not sure if I'm quite managing the modulations though. However, as I did say earlier, conference papers may well end up being published in conference proceedings, so treading that fine line between delivering a live presentation and delivering a live presentation that may also be one in a book. The final thing to note here is that research culture and expectations of how assertive we should be in our voice as researchers may differ between countries and between cultures. Some research cultures, such as that of China, reward scholars for showing how closely their ideas conform to those of existing authorities in the field. Other research cultures, such as that of the US, tend to value novelty and originality, which may require researchers to more assertively distance themselves or differentiate themselves from experts in the field. These differences can be quite important. They make it difficult for journals or publishers from any single country or culture to represent a fully global authorship. The answer is to familiarise yourself as much as possible with the expectations of the journals or book publishers to which you hope to submit your research. What style, tone and voice are adopted in recent books published by your chosen publisher, or in articles published in the most recent issues of your chosen journals. As always, when conducting and publishing your own research in the humanities and beyond, there is no substitute for reading as comprehensively, as diversely, and as critically as you can. Finally, there are 3 publications here, and of course this presentation will be recorded, so you can come back to these at any time. I think that only the first one is specific to the humanities. The other 2 are not, but tend to have a humanities focus, and they are from the last 15 years or so, so are relatively relevant to the current publication context. And all that remains for me now is to say thank you very much to all of you for joining me here. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Okay, if I could ask anyone if they have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we can discuss them further. I think that there's a lot there that's, I mean, it's, yeah, the whole concept of voice, I think is, let's say as a social scientist, you don't really sort of think of it quite in that way, which is, it's good to see, you know, the difference.
Positionality is a correlated construct, though, I think, in the social sciences. So how the researcher is positioned within the research and affects the research in that sort of quantum observation way. And that's, I mean, voice here is, apart from when we're delivering conference papers, voice here I'm using as a metaphor. So it's a very similar kind of idea, positioning, situation, self-situated.
I mean, do you think that having a poor voice, so to speak, would prevent someone from being published?
What do you mean by a poor voice?
So that they don't express, that they come across as a bit arrogant, or that they come across as not forceful enough, or you know, if they don't position themselves suitably. How can I put that? No, the facts are there, the evidence is there, the research is there, and yet the way they've expressed themselves doesn't come across as confidently as you might hope someone to.
Sure, that's a major problem, because in the humanities, the writing in essence is the research, the production of ideas through the text, through the sentences, through the paragraphs. So if you are failing to indicate your own arguments relative to those of others, then you may come across as lacking originality. The value of your research may literally not be clear. Alternatively, it could be so overstated that it seems as though it is not, even if it is valuable, it seems as if it lacks the scholarly rigor that is involved in collating information from a variety of sources. So while style might seem, or voice might seem like a sort of a superficial or aesthetic criterion, it actually massively affects how we deliver our arguments and how they are received, crucially, by reviewers and by publishers.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I mean, so another area. I mean, something that so Ian was the guy who asked about the we one query, and this. I was just thinking how standardization basically across a paper. I mean, I think this came up with I think the first managing editor webinar we did earlier this year, where that was something that, well, everyone was commenting on. You know, how do I standardize? You know, what do I look for when I standardize? So I'm not expecting you to go down that avenue, but I guess standardization is one of those things that we have to be very aware of as we write our papers.
I'd say consistency rather than perhaps standardization in the humanities, but I think standardization in the sciences is vital, and that's something we do, as you know, Nick, as editors when we're working on clients' papers in the sciences and the social sciences. In the humanities, I'd be a little bit more reserved about standardizing. I would try to ensure consistency. If semantics weren't affected, as I said earlier, the use of we versus one versus I can have slightly different meanings that could be disrupted if one were to change them. But I would always recommend variety is no good for its own sake. And consistency has just as much value. So yes, in the humanities, I think we'd as an editor, as I would be very keen to indicate to the clients that that their usage could be more consistent, for example, or ask them to sort of ask themselves why they are being inconsistent or varied.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned something else earlier about using a wider vocabulary so that you'd you know, don't keep using the same word all the time. Sure. However, in the previous webinar, we were saying, don't try too hard. You know, when you've got the participant, and then you've got the patient, and then you have the, you know, and some writers have so many different words to refer to the same person. That's
very important in the sciences and the social sciences, for sure. Absolutely. So and the participants and the patients, absolutely horrifying to think of those two as being considered indiscriminately interchangeable. And I think I tried to say this earlier, that it's a fine line between demonstrating rhetorical and lexical variety and using synonyms for the sake of them. And for that reason, something like the OED, having access to it and being very rigorous in how we do use our synonyms is vital, because those differences can be just so momentous when we are creating an idea. So it's finding a balance between variety and I suppose I certainly do this with synonyms, kind of running away with oneself.
There's your one again.
I know, yes.
I have another quick question here from Zhao Chen. He says, should the first sentence in a paragraph, usually the key point, be long or short? And if so, how long or short, in your opinion?
Goodness, that's a very good question. And I'm not always sure, actually, that in humanities research, the first sentence does contain the key idea. Whether it should or not is another matter. And I think there is great value in that. It depends on the style. I mean, as a rule of thumb, I would recommend that any new section, any new paragraph, particularly if it's a new chapter or something, doesn't start with something too complex, too lengthy. So I'd probably try to err on the short to medium side for a first sentence of a paragraph or section. However, as you know, paragraphs can follow on from each other very, very closely sometimes. Other times they're very, very distinct from previous ones. So in the former case, it may be appropriate to have a longer sentence if you've just had a couple of shorter ones, for example. And I think that one of the important things to do is reading back your work, maybe even reading aloud your work, asking other people to read it and so on, to see if they kind of get the distinction being made here between one paragraph and the next, or the different point being made. And that can help you to kind of clarify where sentences should be trimmed, or where they could do with being a bit more expansive.
Right. Actually, just on a point of editing there, you know, you're saying getting other people to look at your paper. I was doing an exercise with a company here in Hong Kong, and they were a intermediate level English group. So, you know, they were quite sheepish. Some of them were a bit I should say overly humble about their English ability. And yet when they were writing, in this case, emails, and I got them to swap papers and look for mistakes in each other's writing, everybody was able to find ways to improve someone else's paper, in this case, emails are so much shorter. But I think the validity there being that having someone look at your paper, you just, there's so much benefit there. Even
Absolutely.
someone who, you know, they don't have to be an expert to spot the inconsistencies.
The other thing I would say, Nick, in response to that question, is, again, look at your favourite authors in your field. What are they doing with their first sentences of their first paragraphs or their second paragraphs or whatever? And are they doing something consistent? And do you like what they're doing? What do you not like in certain writers? You know, certain writers might be very important in your field, but you may not enjoy reading them. And might that be to do with how their sentences are formed at the beginning of paragraphs? And so not to suggest that one would imitate, although I don't know if any of you work on the Renaissance, but the concept of imitatio is a deeply fruitful one in that period, and so imitation is the best way, was considered the best way to develop one's own style, and probably still is today. If imitating other styles is how we form our own, and ultimately, so not exactly plagiarizing other people's styles, but borrowing from them, learning from them. And sort of figuring out why you admire certain aspects of people's style.
Someone just came back concerning this. Thanks for the further clarification on the previous question. I think the previous question was, Ian, you're referring to the question you asked earlier about the I, we, and one. I think he is. To the question of methodology in the humanities. So often this is a step that is missed or delivered in a less formal manner in this discipline. This could also be said of a review of literature. Can you respond to this question in terms of the humanities voice?
The literature review is a very interesting one, isn't it? Because I think that in most universities require PhD dissertations, for instance, to have a distinct literature review section, a little bit like the sciences and the social sciences in particular. But obviously that isn't something we see in publish journal articles and so on, where the literature review is sort of profoundly integrated with the process of the doing the research. There isn't a point at which one is less or more engaging more or less, particularly with other scholars. The methodology, similarly, I mean, this is an interesting question, isn't it? Because of course, in the humanities, there may be aspects of the research, like archival research, that are historically done at a point in time that you need to reference as being historical events, which may need their own section. Usually, when our methodology it's a slightly artificial construct, but it's as if it's being produced as we write, as if our ideas are being developed as we write, and as if the reader is coming along with them. So it isn't always the case that we need to say specifically what our methodology was, which may lead to the feeling that it's neglected in some contexts. I mean, because of course this is a vital point to make. I'm not sure I made it, that the humanities are so wide that inevitably, and equally that the humanities are becoming increasingly interdisciplinary. So the points I've made here are sort of broad scale, general criteria rather than ones that we can apply to every subject in every case. And in many cases, the methodology, will need to be distinctly summarized. I'm not sure how if that answers.
Does that help, Ian? But yeah, okay. He's happy. All right.
Oh, brilliant.
Cynthia says, if we analyze contents from an intersubjectivity approach, will the word I become meaningful so that it refers to a personal knowing from a unique lived experience?
I think this comes back to what I was saying about the positionality of the researcher earlier in social sciences. I think the moment you have an intersubjectivity context perspective, that means that the use of the first person is so much more loaded, and it may be at that point that you have to be defining from the outset the way that you're using the I, as so many social science researchers. I mean, Nick, you'd be better able to speak about that, perhaps, in the way that social scientists need to construct a selfhood, a writing subject, as it were. The other issue to talk about is it may not apply to any or many of you, but in some branches of literary theory, the writing subject is profoundly vexed. I'm thinking of Derrida, the writing hand, the writing self, the Lacan, and so on. In such cases, one is using theoretical terms. When one uses the I, one refers to the self, etc. One is using theoretical terms borrowed from. It becomes even more complex there, and I would recommend in such cases always defining one's terms and being very clear about when one is using these very vexed ideas. I don't know enough about Derrida quite to make that a full point, but I'm sure that many of you do.
Okay. All right. Cynthia says thank you. Right. I think we're going to draw a line under this now. So thank you very much, Louise, for sharing.
It's my pleasure.
This evening. And for those who've attended, we had a sort of rush of people joining a little later on. So thank you very much for joining us. I know it's probably having to skip dinner, or you're going to have to postpone your dinner a little bit this evening. So thank you very much for joining us. There is, on the screen there's a QR code which takes you to our website. So if you do wish, if you want any help with editing papers that you're writing, then please feel free to contact us. So if you go to the website, there's some links there which take you straight to where you can upload a document for us to review and get back to you on any feedback. If you do have any questions afterwards, please feel free to drop us a line. You will have received an email from us in any case, and we will be sending you a link to this recording in due course as well. So Louise, thank you very much again for your time. I know you're a little under the weather there, but you've done very, very well.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. It's been wonderful.
Yes, thank you, and thanks for all our participants this evening. Until next time, goodbye.